So good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out here tonight. I really appreciate it, and I'm really honored to be able to give this talk as part of this really beautiful exhibition by Hreinn Fridfinnsson, curated by the Museum of Art and Design. And I'm very grateful for the invitation and a very warm welcome. This is actually the first time that I've seen Fridfinsson's art live. In an exhibition, because my encounter with his work was accidental, actually. I'm by no means a specialist, as you could also hear from Paul's introduction. I'm mostly working on Yugoslav art. So actually, I wrote a text about a Yugoslav conceptual artist that a curator of Fridfinsson's Geneva show that took place a couple of years back. It is responsible for the loss of the aura of art. I thought that was funny because despite seeing Fridfinsson's work only in reproduction, I interpreted it precisely as an attempt, as a project of restoring art's aura, or rather restoring the very idea of aura as an index of a reality beyond the purportedly secularized, scientifically measurable, and disenchanted contemporary world. So such a reading necessitated that I discuss his work in relation to concepts such as alchemy and magic, and proposing to see his practice as a kind of oxymoronic magic conceptualism. So basically, my talk tonight will be based on that text that I wrote earlier. I'm going to be reading from this text, but I also want to expand on it to discuss the further ramifications and the potentials of this idea of magic conceptualism that stem from Fridfinsson's work, but that I think are not limited to it. Without wishing to mystify either art or the labor of art historical writing, I found it a challenging task to write about Fridfinsson's art, because what I feel happens in his works is a certain suspension of time and narrative that makes any critical or art historical perspective appear as verbiage, an insult almost, like building on enchanted land. And this is one work that deals precisely with sacred and enchanted places in Iceland. So this narrative suspension operates despite the fact that the works themselves often rely on stories told by others. Take, for example, the I Collected Personal Secrets project, in which Fridfinnsson invited readers of an art magazine to send him their personal secrets, which he promised to keep. The artists appear here as the insurer of the lives of secrets, conferred to him by those who could no longer tend to those lives on their own. The material thus confided was by definition narrative. It was a set of secret stories, shaped by a mixture of desire and dread, glee and shame. The work itself, however, consisted of suspending the narrative drive of this material. Fridfinnsson first placed it in a bank vault, very literally keeping his promise to safely guard the secrets. And after a while, he shredded all the paper on which they were written and encrypted the secrets further by turning them into a quasi-abstract expressionist painting, which was finally exhibited as a work of art, and which we actually have the privilege of seeing right here in front of you. Of course, it can be said that the narrative suspension in this case was simply due to the fact that the work is about secrets, stories that may never be unraveled, but it seems to me that this principle is operative in all, or at least in most, of Fridfinsson's works. They derive from stories, like, for example, the project First House, which is based on the novel Icelandic Aristocracy by Thorbergur Thordarson. But they themselves do not narrate. They are about time, but they stop time. And I think the title of this exhibition, for the time being, is a perfect embodiment of that tension, of that dialectics at a standstill, which is another term that Benjamin used for this kind of state when all opposites somehow merge and stop, and when some kind of revelation happens. So even in those works that include written text, for example, this one that we're seeing right now, the narrative content of this text is ultimately overwritten by a single powerful image or a strange occurrence. For example, in this work's dream, it is the uncanny image of a horse pulling a wagon by means of strings made of light. This suspension of narrative brings to mind yet another seminal text in Western art history, Michael Fried's essay, Art and Objecthood, written in 1967. In this text, Fried criticized minimalist sculpture for being literalist and theatrical. Literalist because by claiming to be neither painting nor sculpture, but an object or a shape, it declared a position that took art towards non-art, as well as a position that can be, as he said, formulated in words, and it has been formulated in words by the artists themselves. Also, it was theatrical because, as he wrote, it concerned itself with the actual circumstances in which the beholder encounters the work. And by taking into account the relation between the visitor's body and the artwork in the gallery space, theatrical work also introduced a sense of the passing of time, whereas the modernist work that Fried championed is timeless, according to him, evoking not duration, but sort of an eternal present, which he called presentness. So we could also say that Fried was basically also about, the project of restoring the aura of art, not letting it become non-art, and not letting art, as he would say, become theater. Now, Fried's objections could be even more strongly applied to the artistic movement that in the US followed minimalism, and this is conceptual art. Conceptual art is certainly literalist in the sense described by Fried, as an art that to a great extent depends precisely on verbalizing its own aesthetic and ideological position. And in this way, it also threatens to displace the authority of the critic, who up to that point was the one credited with this role of verbally interpreting the purportedly silent visual artwork. So Fried himself should have been also challenged by that. Conceptual art is also responsible for an even more radical destruction of the distinction between the traditional artistic mediums, and for opening up the possibility for everything and anything, including language, text, and even idea or thought, to become art. Now understood in a generic post-medium sense, so no longer a painting or sculpture, but simply art. Fridfinsson's works have much in common with both the minimalist and conceptualist aesthetics, with their use of language, repetitive geometrical shapes, and a general disregard of medium specificity. Yet they nonetheless, I would argue, seem to insist on the autonomy of the artwork and are indifferent to the presence of the observer and the passing of time. Paradoxically then, they may look like conceptual art or minimalism, but they retain the modernist ideal that Fried describes as presentness. Fridfinnsson is also not interested in theorizing his own art. He insists on making it, which for him implies a process of attending to the fortuitous and by no means guaranteed moment in which art simply happens. For example, when you accidentally place a shoe in front of a framed mirror. Indeed, for Fridfinnsson, art seems to be first and foremost a procedure of enchantment, a kind of magic. It is thus not by accident that on the rare occasions when the artist is represented in his work, he's shown as a magician, his hands busy with some improbable task, like collecting light rays, bouncing an invisible ball, or tinkering with modern art classics by means of a square-shaped glass and primary colored threads. It is perhaps for this reason, so this proclivity towards tinkering or even magic, that interpreters of his art have often described it as romantic conceptualism. The attribute romantic denoting Fridfinsson's distance, including his geopolitical Icelandic distance from the imagined or the generally accepted normative idea of conceptual art. However, if we compare his work with that of other conceptual artists, even those who are, such as Robert Barry, also often classified as romantic or lyrical conceptualists, we can still see significant differences. In 1986, Barry also made a work about secrets. He instructed the students of the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax to come up with an idea that would be kept secret from anyone outside the group. The work would exist as long as the secret remained intact, but as soon as someone gave away the secret, the work would cease to exist. A similar logic is operative in the art and language work called Secret Painting, which shows a black canvas next to a statement claiming that the content of the painting is invisible and will be kept permanently secret, known to the artist, known only to the artist. A comparison of both those works with Fridfinsson's I Collected Personal Secrets reveals that what separates him from both Barry and art and language, so even if Barry's work is certainly more lyrical than the proverbial intellectualism of art and language, what they are both concerned with are the conditions that define the existence of the work of art. So they are interested in how art comes to be, while Fridfinnsson is concerned with the conditions that define the existence of secrets. Fridfinsson's works also do not include what seems to be, to me, the key tenet of conceptual art, namely a critical or just a skeptical concern with the very conditions that define the making and the circulation of art. A certain contract whereby art and artists stay together yet keep a safe distance. Despite his known reticence, Fridfinnsson does not take a position of distance towards art, nor does he aim to strip it of its aura by unveiling the sort of behind the scenes of art making, which is what a lot of conceptual art does in demystifying the procedure of making and exhibiting art. At the same time, it would be wrong to say that he places art back on the pedestal. It is not art that once again achieves an erratic distance. Rather, Fridfinnsson uses art as the very medium of distance, a medium that points to what is not immediately present and graspable, or as he himself put it, that which is elsewhere, or indefinable. I'm trying to, he says, establish contact with underlying forces which I cannot define. They link everything in a way which obliterates the frontiers between nature outside, the countryside, and the nature of the psyche, which goes on inside our heads. A more apt comparison can be made between his work and Moscow Romantic Conceptualism. And this is a term that philosopher Boris Groys used in 1979 to identify not simply romanticism, but also magic as a persisting condition of art in Russia. In Russia, art is still magic, Groys writes with an exclamation mark. Unlike Western art, which seems to speak about this world, Russian art, according to Groys, from the age of icons to our time, seeks to speak of another world. Groys found evidence for this in the work of the Collective Actions Group, which were founded in 1976. Whose outdoor happenings often involved getting lost in a forest or leaving objects for future viewers to encounter by chance. So Groys writes that, quote, the artist, for example, may leave a ringing bell under the snow or a painted tent in the wood, unquote. Fridfinnsson, of course, did exactly that with First House, an inside-out house built in the midst of a bare Icelandic landscape and left to surprise the rare visitors who happened upon it while walking out in the open, in nature, only to realize that they have been walking and even living inside an inverted house with wallpapers all along. Despite the fact that Groys links Moscow conceptualism's artistic exploration of the inexplicable to the geohistorical exceptionality of the Russian soul, he ultimately implies that such an approach to art is simply part of the common history of humanity. So he writes, there was a time when people believed to come time and again across inexplicable traces of some indefinite presence, signaling the existence of active and purposive forces that acted beyond the limits of common sense explanations. These indications, pointing to the presence of magic forces, can be regarded as facts of art, as opposed to facts of reality, facts that cannot be explained but only interpreted. The artists of the collective actions endeavor to involve the contemporary observer into such accidental encounters or discoveries that will compel him to engage in the process of interpretation. So the key element here is the idea of art as a certain kind of enigma. This is where it's equal to magic, and this is why the encounter with art is primarily an encounter between this enigma and its interpretation. And this is also very similar to Adorno's notion of enigmaticalness as also one of the key features of art. So art should not be, again, literalist. It should not say everything immediately. It should leave some space for imagination and speculation. So it seems that collective actions in Groys's interpretation led the contemporary observer beyond the historical rift between what we may call superstition or magic and the European Enlightenment, on which, of course, also the Soviet communist project was also built. If the Soviet socialist city was the space where this project was exercised in practice, the trips outside the city and into the snowy woods enabled the artists and their audience to step beyond the planned and projected and into the improbable, where one could encounter the atavism of primitive times, of the inexplicable, of magic. A similar thing could be said of Fridfinsson's works and his continually shifting position between the urban Amsterdam art scene and his rural and pagan Icelandic sources. Rather than fully joining the ranks of the Amsterdam art world, which for an Icelandic artist could be said to represent the West and a bridge to the Anglo-American analytical conceptualist tradition, Fridfinnsson has remained a part of Iceland, as he says, while answering a question about the role of superstition in his work. Superstition, he states, is an integral and very natural part of the Icelandic pagan culture. The question is not whether it's important to know whether I believe in this. I am part of it. So for Fridfinnsson, to be a part is not a matter of choice. Belonging is almost compulsive, irreversible, and beyond one's will. This is also how Fridfinnsson often speaks about art making as something compulsive, and he admits that he is often not able to explain why he produces a work. He says, "My works are not much thought out beforehand. They just happen, pretty much. Thought can often be a hindrance. It can sometimes be in the way. When making an artwork, I am in the sort of flow which is natural to me, and then I look behind, and then I see, and all the connections become kind of obvious." So the work process that he describes here paints a picture of an artist tuning into the invisible forces that precede reflection, which is also what separates him from the Moscow Romantic conceptualists who, despite their flirtation with magic, at least in Groys's interpretation, implemented very strict and quite bureaucratized protocols of planning, documenting, and interpreting their work and all these trips into nature. It is not that Fridfinnsson does not also pay attention to these aspects of art making, but he does not foreground them. They are not, for him, what ultimately matters. He's not interested in initiating a discursive field of collective discussion and interpretation. Art simply is, whatever it may or may not be. So Hreinn is very much aware that all these things amount to his aberration from the norm, as he was often accused for not conforming to what he calls rigid conceptualism, whose subversive character he says he appreciated, but which, due to his different cultural background, was not in his nature. "You know, I was often accused of romanticism," he says, "which was really disliked, heavily disliked. It was forbidden stuff." He may as well be accused of really using the word natural and nature, which are probably the most despised lexical entries in the entire dictionary of post-structuralist theory and art theory. And this, of course, the deconstructive impetus of post-structuralism has much in common with this reflexive and demystifying distance of conceptual art. But as well as straying from conceptualism, Fridfinsson's work is actually also missing a crucial element of romanticism, namely the foregrounding of the figure of the artist. Despite the intimate references ingrained in many of his works, they are almost completely devoid of the kind of pathos characteristic of romantic art and of expression. They're also devoid of any kind of heroism, a trait that art theorist Peter Osborne rightly defined as the romantic element in the work of many conceptual artists in their rebellion against art and society. So drawing a tiger, a diptych that shows the artist seated in a landscape and drawing in 1951 as a boy in Iceland and in 1971 as a blossoming conceptual artist in Holland, is less a commentary on the formation of artistic subjectivity and more an identification of a not entirely understood correspondence, or once again, the halting of time. 20 years later, still drawing a tiger, still looking for the alchemical secret of primary matter. Fridfinsson's work, then, is adequately described neither as romantic conceptualism nor as a conceptual romanticism, but more as a sort of magic conceptualism or conceptual magic, a forbidden art of alchemy in which the artist does not claim to know the ultimate trick of transmutation, but keeps the window open in case the invited secret ever wishes to appear. Just like in the piece After a While, in which his work desk remains prepared for a shadow of a flying bird that might pass across his hands at any moment, or at least after a while. Indeed, there are many elements of alchemy in Fridfinsson's work. Alchemy understood not as an experimental hunt for gold or immortality, but as a spiritual scientific pursuit. His amateur interest in science, mathematics, geometry, form, materiality, and in particular his emphasis on duality, mirroring correspondences between the inside and the outside, the microcosm and the macrocosm, are decidedly alchemical. Even if he, unlike a number of early 20th century artists, for example, Max Ernst, may not have been directly influenced by this occult tradition. Attending a photographic diptych in which an oval mirror is first held against the sky above to reflect the grass below and then turned around against the grass to reflect the sky is a striking example of Fridfinsson's attending to alchemical correspondences, the formula as above, so below. Tinkering with the existence of laws that connect one thing to another and that are perhaps even able to reveal connections between all things. The hour resembles a stage prepared for some kind of seance, where a scientist, magician, artist is about to demonstrate hidden knowledge by means of a silver ball, a golden cone, some wood, tar, and a silhouette of a flying bird. Objects of everyday, prosaic, or even violent use, such as cardboard boxes, paint shop stirring rods, chicken wire, use the exhibition space as a stage on which to transform themselves into captivating yet humble miracles. In extreme contrast to Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes, plain cardboard boxes open up with iridescent and hypnotizing glow. Randomly colored wooden sticks used in paint shops for searing and testing wall paint arrange themselves into aesthetic patterns that exude regularity and planning. And chicken wire becomes a palace, indexing a hexagonal structure of the crystal molecule and a pattern of the universe. At the same time, the fragility and the ephemerality of the works prevents them from turning into instances of an aestheticized and also anestheticized reality of which any rigid conceptual artist or critics would be wary. Rather, all these are very subtle transformations or even transmutations of reality which point to the existence of what is not evident and immediately graspable. Does this alchemical artistic pursuit derive from Fridfinsson's Icelandic background, from the fact that he is, after all, an Icelandic conceptual artist? He himself implies as much by drawing upon tropes of Icelandic cultural identity, even if this places him in a position of self-exoticizing the Icelandic we. There is, he says, some kind of cozy relationship in our minds between the rational and the irrational, the natural and the supernatural. And he continues, "Unfortunately, I have never seen a spirit, an elf, or a ghost, but I know some very sane and sober persons who have." The artist's regret about not experiencing an otherworldly encounter, so rather than a supposedly enlightened rejection of the very idea, only proves that his art is precisely a sane and sober pursuit of such an encounter with that which, due to lack of scientific explanations, has been relegated to the scandalous realm of magic because it could not fit either the scientific or religious dogmas. Iceland, in this case, is situated as the geopolitical location that, for one reason or another, is particularly conducive to such an alchemical pursuit of heresy in the face of the grand narratives of Enlightenment, Christianity, as well as conceptual art. After all, Iceland is the place where children's toys, a shell and a bone, have been known to transmute into gold. So what then is magic conceptualism, if this, as I propose, should be the name of this heresy? What do we get when we create this seemingly oxymoronic amalgam of conceptual art and magic? From a historical perspective, or rather according to conventional art historical narratives, conceptual art stands at the opposite end from magic. Magic is the beginning of art, while conceptual art is its end. As is evident also from Groys's account of the ancient times when people believed in the presence of invisible forces, art is said to have begun as magic. Classical art history surveys such as Ernst Gombrich's Story of Art, as well as the Social History of Art by the Marxist sociologist and art historian Arnold Hauser, equate Paleolithic art with magic. However, magic is here not understood in the sense of invoking contact with otherworldly spirits or beings, but rather as a very pragmatic material practice which completely merged art and life. So painting an image of a bison on the walls of a cave meant calling the animal into existence, manifesting it, as we would say in the New Age jargon today, beckoning its appearance as prey, as food. Paleolithic world was, according to Hauser, a monistic one. Everything was connected. There was no clear distinction between the world and its symbolic representation. And it is precisely this inability to differentiate between sign and its reference that is considered as the key element of magical thinking. So in seeing magic as a material, embodied practice, Hauser is following the tradition established by the Scottish anthropologist James Fraser, who in his famous turn-of-the-century book, The Golden Bough, made a distinction between magic and religion. Magic was the direct tinkering with nature, we might say, using Fridfinsson's vocabulary, a sort of primitive science and not religion. There were no gods yet to be summoned to intervene into worldly affairs. For Hauser, again, it is only with the shift from the hunter-gathering to agricultural societies that religion appears, as an expression of man's inability to control the forces of nature upon which crops depended, and therefore the need to seek divine intervention. This is also the moment of the appearance of abstract art, abstract Neolithic art, as a mirror of the new dualistic world. So no longer we have a world that is one, but we have the material world of visible reality on the one hand and the metaphysical realm inhabited by spirits and gods on the other. So for many centuries after, art served the religious metaphysical function by which men strove to appease the gods, or later the single monotheistic God. The story of Western art is usually told as a story of liberation. Over time, art liberates itself from its service to religion and the state, and the nobility, and at the same time, humanity liberates itself from all forms of authority and delusions, including those of superstition and religion, which are supplanted by rational and evidence-based science. 19th century art marks the moment when art achieved autonomy, when it claimed to have no other purpose than to exist for its own sake. The 20th century then staged the struggle between the modernist claims for art's autonomy and the avant-garde demand that art be brought back into life, as a tool of political or utopian struggle. In a way, we can say that this avant-garde demand could be understood as a return to seeing art as a magic, since it is only in prehistoric times as magic that art had the power to directly act upon and transform reality, according to these standard accounts, of course. The advent of conceptual art in the late 60s can be regarded as the high point of this avant-garde demand of merging art and life, but at the same time, its dissolution. Conceptual art negated all earlier aesthetic and institutional boundaries of art, liberating art from the prison of the visual and redefining art as action and idea. But at the same time as opening up a disorienting space of unlimited possibilities, conceptual art is also the moment when art takes an honest look in the mirror, so to speak, and decides that there is nowhere else to go, since the whole idea of art, its protagonists, its institutions, has now been deconstructed and demystified. So this paradoxical condition of the simultaneous proliferation and stasis of art is one reason why contemporary art today is often described as an afterlife of conceptual art and is termed either post-historical or post-conceptual. So this account would elucidate the relation between conceptual art and magic seen from the point of view of the standard story of Western art history. But the story of magic is not only one of time, but also of space and the colonial conquest and subordination of non-Western people and spaces. In the classical 19th century anthropological account of Edward Burnett Tyler, who is credited with introducing the concept of animism, magic practices and what he called occult sciences were linked to the lower races and to the lowest known stages of civilization represented by Africans, Aborigines, and Native Americans. While magic persisted, as he acknowledged even in modern societies, as a remnant of, or as a revival of the savage traditions, ultimately, these practices were to be displaced by modern civilization and Christianity, which, unlike the dangerous occult practices, Tyler deemed to be a rational religion. However, as scholar Jason Josephson Storm recently argued, this persistence of the occult in Europe is not simply limited to folkloristic peasant customs, but can be located at the heart of Western philosophical and knowledge systems, which, in his view, created a myth of modernity as the age of disenchantment. While disenchantment may have existed as a project, Josephson Storm claims, it was never fully realized. And the rationalizing drive was continually both interspersed and confronted with the remnants and revivals of both Western and non-Western savage traditions. The same could be said about the history of modern art, which has also been written as a fully secularized narrative of emancipation, whether this emancipation is understood as aesthetic or political. At the same time, the significant impact that various esoteric, spiritualist, or primitivist traditions had on many of its protagonists is regularly excluded and projected onto the non-Western cultural traditions. So rather than catching up with or deriving their own questions from the narratives of Western modernisms and modernities, so-called peripheral art histories should in fact serve as guides for Western art history to deal with its own problem of the relation between modernity and tradition, its own problem which it doesn't acknowledge, between art and non-art, including all the weird, forbidden stuff, as Fridfinnsson would say. Decolonizing art history would mean not simply to keep adding ever new alternative attributes to what remains the central term of the discussion, namely modernism. And we have really had in the past decades an influx of these. There are all sorts of aberrant modernisms, alternative modernism, but they always maintain this key term, modernism. So instead of doing that, decolonizing art history would mean to derive from decolonial aesthetic and political struggles completely new categories in light of which the still alive canon of Western art can be seen anew. This is a view from the exhibition Magicien de la Terre, which I'm going to address now before closing, which I think is an interesting case study, because although it was heavily criticized as perpetuating the very colonial appropriation of non-Western culture that it attempted to confront, I think it brought something that is worth revisiting today. So this exhibition was organized in the Center of Western Culture in Paris in 1989, and during the time when the world was undergoing major geopolitical shift followed by the end of the Cold War. In the Georges Pompidou Center, the curator Jean-Hubert Martin decided to hold what he declared as the first worldwide exhibition, gathering 100 artists, 50 from the centers and 50 from the peripheries, and named this exhibition Les Magiciens de la Terre, the Magicians of the Earth. The exhibition included both the artists who were already part of the structures of the international art world, as well as various indigenous practices that were until then not considered as part of the history of art, but rather as ethnographic phenomena. In order to avoid presenting those practices as remnants of some bygone era, Martin invited their creators to develop works on site, specifically for the exhibition. But he did not do that in order to simply include them in the category of art as understood in the West. Just the opposite, he challenged the very category of art as a parochial Western phenomenon and renamed all artists in the show, including those from the artistic centers, into magicians. In a text that he wrote in preparation for the exhibition, he defined the work of art as a particular invention of our, that is, Western culture, which today, he said, is in a state of commercialized overproduction, which undermines its spiritual value. By contrast, he says, many other societies do not have a concept of art, but create images whose function is to contain a living soul. Martin also rejected the Western evolutionary model of art history, which sees art as a series of breakthroughs. He wrote, since the beginning of the century, generation after generation has sought to recreate the ultimate work, the final picture, specifically noting conceptual art as the decisive stage of reaching for this absolute and isolating itself from every other movement and every other culture in the process. Although it had a noble intention to re-examine art, Martin claims, conceptual art's self-reflective discourse and its hermeticism prevented its intercourse with any other culture than our own. So it was interesting to me from the standpoint of my reading about Fridfinsson's art and this idea of magical conceptualism, that Martin would take conceptual art as the epitome of everything that he saw was wrong with Western art at the time, and the solution to which he proposed a return to art understood as magic. Even if he could rightly be criticized for dramatizing the supposedly soulless state of the art in the West and idealizing, on the other hand, its spiritual value in other cultures, and despite the fact that critiques of his exhibition as neo-colonialist and exoticizing were to a great extent justified, I would like to defend his essentially alchemical gesture of renaming art into magic. It was namely the very title of the exhibition, Magicians of the Earth, which caused the most outrage. Many participating artists hated it, but to simply say that the renaming of art into magic is an oversimplified reversal and an exoticizing move is too easy a critique, I think, because Martin's intention was not to be subtle and analytical. The work of undoing and unlearning the entire history of Western cultural and economic hegemony could not be a subtle affair. In many ways, the gesture went against the political correctness and supposed analytical subtlety of Western critical thought, and was offered as a genuine proposal or even provocation. Most crucially, it decided, it used a conceptualist gesture. This is just another view of the exhibition. I think the first image shows how the encounters between the works of the artists from the centers and from the peripheries, sometimes at some points in the exhibition really seemed like clashes, and at other points they seemed like there was a harmonious relation between the two, which I also found interesting. But what is crucial for me here is that Martin, ironically, used a decidedly conceptualist gesture to perform this provocation, and this is the gesture of nominalism, or using language to change reality, just as Marcel Duchamp did in the foundational conceptualist gesture when he renamed a urinal into fountain and signed it, thus making it into a work of art. Ironically, however, so more irony, this foundational conceptualist gesture is also the foundation of magic, since magic operates precisely thanks to this inability to distinguish a sign from its referent. Magic depends on performative language, on secret formulas and casting of spells. So this unintended encounter of conceptual art and magic ultimately reveals that magic is in fact an integral part of so-called rigid conceptualism, and its reliance on the transformative and performative power of language and utterance, which are the key tools of a magician. Just as they are the primary tools of the magic of cognitive capitalism, of which the rigid conceptualist turn in art has stood as a major sign. So one of the more famous critiques of conceptual art is by art historian Benjamin Buchloh, who related conceptual art so what seemed to be a revolution in art actually turned out to be just another way to basically merge with the flows of the new forms of capitalism, which was now cognitive capitalism, or capitalism based on knowledge and on creativity. So it is no wonder then that the contemporary art, which is defined as art that comes after conceptual art, has to a great extent depended on the linguistic magic, once it became clear that the avant-garde promise of art transforming reality has failed. Embracing the consolatory mantra that art is not about providing answers, but about posing questions, and this is the art world version of it's not important to win, but to participate. Countless exhibitions and conferences have asked, but rarely answered, whether we can do or imagine this or that. Can we find forms of work that are not complicit with violence exploitation? Can we reactivate the utopias of the past? Can we find protocols for imagining the future, etc.? No, we cannot, at least not by reveling in wishful thinking, or rather wishful questioning, which is usually what a lot of these exhibitions and the discourse of contemporary art stops at. And actually today I had a very interesting discussion with Paul exactly about that. This is an example of the magic thinking of conceptual art. Robert Rauschenberg's telegram that says, "This is a portrait of Iris Clare, if I say so." So, a classical sort of a casting of spell, a magical gesture, a magical conceptualist gesture. But yeah, this is just, this slide is an example of what I was talking about earlier, about this discourse of emancipation and saving the world that usually remains just a discourse. So this is an example of an efflux announcement, a symposium titled International Summit on Curatorial Activism and the Politics of Shock. And it was organized in response to the rise of nationalism and radical conservatism. And this is I think this was the time when Trump was in power. But to these questions, what is to be done to the re-emerging nationalism, racism, and fascism all over the world, the event promised decisively, so to these what is to be done questions, the event promised what is to be said solution, as it stated that, quote, some of the world's leading curators and thinkers about museums and exhibitions will gather in New York for a public reading and discussion of manifestos and declarative talks written especially on these topics for this extraordinary event. So such romanticized fetishizations of art's declarative power reveal that contemporary art is indeed an heir to the conceptualist dematerialization, with all the priestly connotations implied in the privilege of immaterial labor. According to Marx and Engels, priests were the first immaterial laborers, and artists could be seen as their heirs. By the same token, contemporary art can also be viewed as a mirror of economic financialization, as it's a declarative form, the form of either a wish or promise of a better world or a better art, mimics the form of a futurist contract in which the consummation of the expected profit is always postponed, with all the libidinal economy implied in such a transaction. Martin himself interestingly acknowledged that the Western world was far from being free of magic, noting the irony of many contemporary works of art being deliberately meaningless, while at the same time having explosive prices, and stating that this disconnect could not be explained in any other way than by a kind of magic. The magic, of course, that he had in mind was the commodity fetishism that defined the Western capitalist religion, and with which the production of art was and is inescapably intertwined. In fact, some artists in the exhibition, such as Barbara Kruger, questioned the notion of magic precisely by examining all the various locations that it can be identified in the world, and offering a long list of magicians, including priests, doctors, politicians, computer programmers, spies, and arms dealers. Finally, both the exhibition Magicien de la Terre and Fridfinsson's Magic Conceptualism have thus revealed the so-called rigid conceptualism, or mainstream conceptual art, to have always already been inflected by magic. In this sense, Fridfinsson's art enables us to perform an alchemical trick and use its Icelandic anchorage not as a proof of its cultural otherness and difference, but instead as a reverse mirror that shows the forbidden stuff of magic in the center of the supposedly enlightened power of critical thought, the pride in critical thought, as Isabel Stengers wrote, ignores the fact that, quote, we are the heirs of an operation of cultural and social eradication, the forerunner of what was committed elsewhere in the name of civilization and reason. Acknowledging that is the first step to decolonizing both the intellectual history and the history of art. And I think that, or at least for me, this is ultimately the key lesson of Fridfinsson's work. Thank you.